Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Miyosh Majore, and I will be talking to my colleagues Andrew Loftusness and Jared Jeter about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our weekly forecast monitor published every Friday alongside this podcast. So today, we're going to start off with a brief roundup of all the major developments happening in each of our hotspots, which as a reminder are the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And we'll also take a quick look at some developments out of Sudan, Armenia, and Venezuela. We will then go into a bit of a deeper discussion on US troop withdrawal from Europe, as well as the state of various ceasefires around the world. But let's jump into our roundup, starting with you, Andrew.
So this week in the Middle East, we saw a trend towards the diplomatic de-escalation scenario, as Iran is currently, at the time of recording, considering a one-page peace proposal from the U.S. that would declare an immediate end to the war, including the U.S. blockade, and then set a timetable later down the road for discussion on U.S. sanctions on Iran, freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran's nuclear program. Meanwhile, Trump announced that the U.S. campaign to guide commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, which had been dubbed Operation Project Freedom, has now been paused. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on May 5th that a peace deal between Israel and Lebanon was, quote, imminently achievable. Meanwhile, inside Lebanon itself, Israel has issued new evacuation orders for population centers in southern Lebanon on May 6th and on May 7th conducted an airstrike inside of Beirut for the first time since agreeing to a U.S.-mediated ceasefire in April. Turning now to the war in Ukraine, the Russia-Ukraine war trended towards the status quo once again as Ukraine rejected a temporary ceasefire proposal from Russia, which was intended to cover the period of May 8th to May 9th to coincide with Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. This cancellation from Ukraine comes after Russian airstrikes killed at least 27 Ukrainians on May 5th. Meanwhile, Russia has enacted a number of internet blackouts inside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, citing security concerns related to Victory Day celebrations. In diplomatic news, Secretary of National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, is scheduled to meet with U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in Miami this week to discuss peace efforts. The U.S. State Department approved a potential weapons sale to Ukraine worth over $300 million, and President Trump said that he would go, quote, a lot further after ordering the withdrawal of 5,000 troops from Germany. The withdrawal from Germany brings into doubt a Biden-era defense agreement with the U.S. and Germany involving the deployment of long-range strike capabilities inside of Germany. The latest from the German Defense Ministry is that there has not been a definitive cancellation of that agreement. And that's all for my sections. Over to you, Jared, for the Indo-Pacific.
Thanks, Andrew. So over in the Indo-Pacific, we've seen a slow trend towards hybrid escalation, mostly as Beijing has instructed Chinese importers of Iranian oil to ignore recent sanctions imposed by the U.S., while also privately ordering a halt to any yuan-dominated loans to the sanctioned entities. China has also demanded that the EU remove its sanctions against Chinese entities from the bloc's latest sanction package against Russia. The EU took steps to ban Chinese renewable energy hardware from its energy transition funding schemes, while the European Commission's new cybersecurity directive proposal would also see a ban against Huawei technology in critical infrastructure. The U.S. Secretary Scott Bessent met with Chinese officials, where both sides laid out the agenda items and demands and complaints ahead of the upcoming meeting between President Trump and President Xi. We have also seen North Korea formally remove reunification with the South as a national goal from its constitution. We've also seen some interesting developments from individual countries in Asia. In security news, we've also seen China condemn two former defense ministers to death. Wei Fenghe and Li Shangfu had been found guilty on corruption and graft charges, and they've been given a death sentence with a 2-year reprieve. There's also some developments from Taiwan that they recently sent their foreign minister to Eswatini to kind of smooth over the relational gap, which occurred last week following Chinese pressure. And in Japanese news, Japan and Australia have signed a new comprehensive trade agreement focusing on energy and security needs between the two states, as both of them have tried to decouple from Chinese markets and establish a more comprehensive relationship where they don't need to be so reliant on either Beijing or Washington.
Thank you both. Now, turning to some of the other notable developments that we've been keeping an eye on this week, starting with Sudan. The Sudanese government has accused Ethiopia and the United Arab Emirates of conducting a recent drone strike against Khartoum International Airport in the capital. No one was wounded in the attack, but Sudan first accused both countries of conducting direct strikes against it earlier this year, following drone launches from Ethiopian territory back in March from an upgraded airport capable of launching drones. Both the UAE and Ethiopia deny all involvement. Shifting to Venezuela and Guyana are attending hearings in the International Court of Justice this week related to the disputed ownership of the Essequibo region. The jungle-filled region is rich in resources including diamonds, oil and timber. The ICJ has held hearings related to this matter since 2019. And finally, in Armenia hosted two back-to-back summits with European leaders, the 8th European Political Community Summit, as well as the first bilateral Armenia-EU summit. Building on Armenia's formal commitments to integrate further with the EU, both sides signed a connectivity partnership which will see boosted critical infrastructure and trade routes through Armenia as part of the EU's Global Gateway strategy. This summit marks the latest step in what appears to be Armenia's ambitions to pivot to a closer alliance both with the EU and the US while loosening ties with Russia. And that concludes our roundup. So I wanted to now pivot back to a deep dive related to developments surrounding some of the ceasefires that we've been seeing around the world. But I wanted to open up the discussion perhaps with you here, Andrew. So we got the news this week, as you mentioned up top, that the United States is removing around 5,000 troops or so from Germany. What's your take on this? Is this something that we should be concerned about?
I mean, it's definitely something to be concerned about if you're looking at this from the perspective of U.S. commitment to its traditional alliances in Europe, right? Which no doubt the Europeans are. Now, there's a number of ways that we could analyze this. It is, of course, very significant. I've seen conflicting reports out there about what sort of units will actually be withdrawn and what sort of capabilities they might take with them back to the United States. Now, the other important thing to note here, as we touched on in the intro, is that Trump has promised basically much more, a lot further, to use a direct quote from the president.
I'm actually curious, Andrew. So I know that a lot of the discourse, especially in the United States, revolves around, the Trump administration's perceived freeloading that the European nations have been doing on U.S. defense capabilities, and that this move may be a bit of a counter to that. But are there any other examples you can think of some of the advantages that the United States has intrinsically by having troops in Germany in the first place?
Yeah, 100%. And I'm not sure if we're seeing a reflection of this in policy from the White House, not only with U.S. defense posture in Europe, but, certain operational decisions that have been made with the war in Iran, including the decision to start the war at all. But the ability of the United States to reliably have forward deployed troops and significant assets in Europe plays a huge role, not only in European defense, and I would argue directly in defense of the U.S. homeland as well, but also in the ability of the United States to project hard military power around the world, right? We saw those bases in Europe were critical for the war effort for 20 years during the war on terror. And right now, the United States is starting to see what it looks like when you either take that for granted or simply don't bother to coordinate with your allies on matters such as going to war in other parts of the world, right? Of course, I'm talking about Iran. So there's a lot that could be said there, but at the highest level, I think that this will confirm, especially the way that this announcement from Trump played out, which was essentially a diplomatic spat between himself and the German chancellor. And I think that this choice has confirmed what a lot of Europeans already suspected, which is that, at least for right now, they probably cannot depend on the United States for that traditional defense role that their defense institutions have always assumed.
Yeah, this is also really interesting what we've been seeing with the reaction from certain European leaders. Shortly after this announcement was made, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni mentioned that she opposes U.S. decoupling from Europe, that she thinks that Germany has not been working hard enough to kind of work with American authorities. And this is something that we've really seen from people like Giorgia Meloni, because she has been one of the more positive figures for the Trump administration. She's been had a much closer relationship with Trump himself. And Italy is obviously one of these type of countries that doesn't want to see U.S. decoupling. And Europe, nobody really in Europe wants to see it at the moment because of how dependent they are for security and economic needs from the United States. However, this current spat is, I think, really showing European leaders how delicate the situation can be and how important independent security policy can be. And this is the rhetoric that we've been seeing from European leaders as of late.
Definitely. And I think there's been a pattern of subsequent European leaders, each one initially being favored by the Trump administration, being favored by Trump himself. You mentioned Meloni definitely was up there, as was Keir Starmer of the UK, as was even Merz from Germany at one point. But each in turn have done something or said something that has clearly provoked a reaction from the Trump administration, enough so that there has, in this case, even been a material consequence. And it's definitely true that there is a pattern emerging, and the European ambitions towards autonomous defense capabilities have been ongoing for a while. But I think, there are some latent issues with regards to not only the dependence on the US in that regard, but also the procurement and access to these indigenous so-called capabilities that Europe can provide for itself. I think the timeline is still quite long. And on that point, actually, Andrew, you mentioned up top not only the troop withdrawal, but the potentially stalled delivery of long-range strike capabilities by the United States to Europe. What's the situation with that? It seems that there's conflicting information on that front.
Sure, I don't want to speculate. I'm not sure what the truth is, to be frank. There are some articles out there that are a few days older saying that the deployment of these Tomahawk missiles, potentially other weapon systems, has been canceled. The German Defense Ministry issued a statement saying that there is, quote, no definitive cancellation. Interpret that as you will. But again, I refer you back to the latest statement from Trump, which is that he promises a lot more action, a lot more follow-on action. Realistically, right now, it's unclear if that threat for follow-on action is something that the American president will actually follow through on, right? The president is known, of course, for issuing very direct policy statements and then backtracking on them shortly thereafter. We're seeing this again in Iran right now with the so-called Operation Project Freedom. So I'm certain that the German Defense Ministry is trying to lay low right now and see exactly where things settle in the White House. But yeah, I think the most important point here is that, let's say Trump, in fact, does stop after the 5,000 are pulled out. At this point, it's fair to say that, for a number of other reasons as well, the damage is already done in terms of European decision-making in their strategic calculus in terms of their own long-term defense capabilities. I think there's no question there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that we're going to be seeing a lot more news coming out from that front. And there's certainly challenges remaining on the European front in terms of their own procurement, as I mentioned. But perhaps the end or possible end of hostilities with Iran could, give an indication as to whether or not Trump will follow through. And I actually think this is a good transition point to talk about some of the news that we've been seeing out of Iran. So on my end, I've been seeing the word ceasefire thrown around a lot this week, not only with regards to Iran, but also on the Russia-Ukraine front, also with regards to Lebanon. But Iran, there seems to be, dare I say, some form of hope at an end of hostilities in sight. Am I reading that correctly?
There is a chance that you are reading that correctly, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So I'll just remind listeners that there is currently a ceasefire in place. There was initially a 2-week ceasefire agreed upon in April. It was then extended after extensive and currently ongoing Pakistani mediation efforts. That ceasefire has come under a significant amount of pressure in the last couple of days. The U.S. and Iran exchanged naval fire in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran conducted a ballistic missile attack against the UAE for the first time since the ceasefire was agreed to. What's on the table right now is a proposal from the U.S. to permanently end the war. All that we can say for certain is that it is a one-page proposal, which would end the fighting, including the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports. I don't want to say most significantly, but also very importantly, the proposal would not, there's no agreement on the table right now for anything regarding the future of Iran's nuclear program or the future of the U.S. sanctions against Iran, ballistic missile production inside Iran, Iranian support to its proxy network, any of the reasons that the U.S. gave for going to war in the first place. What I understand is that the agreement would, again, end the war, and then both sides would agree to conduct a period of talks for at least 30 days with the hope of resolving all of those issues that I just went through. I'll just remind listeners, the latest is that the Iranians are reviewing that proposal right now. As we record, they have not, I just checked, there has not been an official response as of yet. That could very well change by the time this podcast comes out. And again, Trump has threatened to resume bombing essentially immediately if the Iranians reject this offer.
So on the one hand, we have the situation in Iran, but at the same time, we have a couple of other ceasefires or possible lack thereof going around the world, namely one in Lebanon, as well as a breaking of ceasefire in Ukraine with regards to the upcoming Russian military parade. So what's the situation on those fronts?
So in Lebanon, there is notionally on paper a ceasefire in place right now. This was much to the ire of course, the Lebanese, but also the Iranians and the Pakistanis and most of America's allies in Europe. This was, at the insistence of the United States, a separate diplomatic effort from the one that achieved the current ceasefire that is in place in Iran. Now, since that separate ceasefire in Lebanon has been agreed to, Israeli operations have in fact expanded on the ground in terms of its ground campaign. At the beginning of this week, Israel resumed strikes north of the Litani River, and as of yesterday conducted its first airstrike inside Beirut, again since the agreement of this ceasefire. Now, from what we can tell, going off statements from senior Israeli, Lebanese, and U.S. officials like Marco Rubio, there's a lot of willingness to come to the table and achieve some sort of a deal between the Lebanese government and Israel. Of course, the position of Hezbollah in any potential peace agreement or a new ceasefire is a completely different story. And Rubio himself has said that Hezbollah is the main holdup here, and he thinks that some sort of a historic deal between the Israelis and the Lebanese government itself is perhaps imminent, to use the secretary's own words. So we'll certainly keep our eye on that. Now, in Ukraine, it's a very interesting case. So the latest is that Putin actually offered a temporary ceasefire to the Ukrainians. the reason why is because May 9 is Victory Day in Russia, which of course is when the Russians celebrate the Soviet victory over the Nazis in World War II. In Putin's Russia, this has taken on a particular amount of significance for his government and for his war effort in Ukraine. Now, it's very interesting. From what we understand, Putin offered this temporary ceasefire to the Ukrainians and also spoke with Donald Trump directly and more or less asked him to lean on the Ukrainians to accept it. Now, this would be, in theory, a temporary ceasefire in Russia and in Ukraine. The Ukrainians, of course, were very skeptical and then ended up rejecting the offer out of hand. A couple of days later, as we noted in the introduction, there's been a series of there's Russian strikes in Ukrainian cities daily, but in the last couple of days, there's been a series of particularly vicious strikes that have resulted in some of the largest casualty counts so far this year. So the Ukrainians rejected the offer. Now, inside of Russia, in particular in Moscow and St. Petersburg, tensions are very, very high over security concerns related to May 9 and specifically the military parade inside of Moscow. We know that Putin himself is taking extra security measures for his own personal physical security for the first time. I don't know if I can say ever, but in several years at the very least, there will not be any military hardware on display in Moscow. I'm sure we've all seen those images of the Russian army marching past Putin. That's off the table this year. There's been a number of internet blackouts that the Kremlin has enforced, again, in Russia and St. Petersburg. That's causing quite the stir amongst the Russian population, at least in terms of chatter and people's willingness to publicly make statements with their name attached to it. There's been some very serious discontent that I think is causing some worry amongst the Kremlin. Anyways, that being said, we will definitely keep our eye on what happens in Moscow over this weekend.
Yeah, definitely notable to see the change in public opinion or calling out of the government. I think recent Ukrainian oil strikes against oil refineries that have caused a substantial amount of environmental damage against Russian cities have also caused a severe level of discontent. So definitely keeping an eye on that. And I think to round all of this off, I wanted to briefly involve China in the discussion. I mean, on my end, I think it will be interesting to see, with regards to the Iranian discussion, the role that China will end up playing. This is something that we've mentioned before. We know that next weekend is the summit between Trump and Xi. I think there's a high chance that there will be some US demands made in order to get China more involved in curbing Iran's role as an active military player. But at the same time, it will be interesting to see what demands China makes out of the US in return. Jared, I know that you are keeping an eye on all things China. So what are some of the things that you've been looking at this past week?
Yeah, so in regards to what's been going on between China and Iran, China kind of has two ways of looking at this. China is obviously very much benefiting from the geopolitical alienation of the United States. They're benefiting from being able to present themselves as a more reasonable power and a reasonable alternative to American power. However, China, being a very oil-dependent country themselves, are also very economically interested in seeing this war come to a swift conclusion. So they're both benefiting and detracting from this, and their concerns are absolutely going to be to try and maximize their political advantage from this conflict by being able to pull over different allies and be able to present themselves as a better alternative to the United States, both economically and in terms of geopolitical security. However, they also are going to be very interested in seeing this war come to a close, as not to threaten their own precarious oil situation.
Yeah, there was some interesting news to that regard with the The US imposed sanctions on oil purchases and oil refiners in China that were purchasing oil from Iran. And initially we got a statement from the Ministry of Commerce that, that basically Beijing was instructing the sanctioned entities to ignore those sanctions and to just continue as business as usual. But actually, we've also gotten the news that the financial regulator has been warning its banks across China not to provide any loans to those refineries. So we're kind of seeing a bit of a balancing act that Beijing is trying to strike between appearing tough with regards to defying the United States publicly, while at the same time not wishing to incur any further economic damage, just as you said.
It is also worth noting that despite being a authoritarian state for whom they control most aspects of their own national economy, there is a lot of dissent internally within China from this, as they do have a more developed free market than many authoritarian states. And a lot of these people inside the Chinese business community are kind of screaming about this. So it's like many people inside the Politburo are delighted by the way that this is increasing China's strategic position, but there's a lot of growing dissent from internal economic elements within the CCP and in the broader Chinese economy, because they're making up for their recent shortfall by increasing amount of Russian oil imports, but there's only so much that they can offset if the Iranian situation continues.
Yeah, and speaking of Politburo and dissent, there was news, as you mentioned up top, of potential death sentences being issued out. So what's the story there?
So the story there is almost a kind of macabre business as usual, in that this is the most recent example of a very long line of Chinese officials that have either been arrested or executed for corruption and graft. Now, corruption and graft is a very common charge ever since Xi Jinping assumed power in 2012, and most geopolitical analysts agree that while there certainly is a lot of corruption within the CCP as an institution, many of the people that are actually found guilty of it are people that have run afoul of the current administration. The Xi administration has centralized power more so than any other leader in Chinese history aside from Mao Zedong himself. And right now, we are seeing a consistent purge of both political and military officials as Xi Jinping attempts to consolidate power around himself. Given his unwillingness to name an official successor, as almost all other premiers and presidents have done, this shows an intention for him to maintain power over the course of his entire life and attempting to consolidate it as much as possible. So while corruption is certainly something that exists in a rather systemic level in the CCP, it's likely, very much so, that the execution of these two former defense ministers is yet another manifestation of the Xi administration's attempt to eliminate any type of political dissent, particularly from in the military, because over the last 10 years, the Chinese military has increased enormously in power within the CCP itself. For a very long time, they were always kept as an extremely subordinate position to the party itself. But as the military has been increasing in both capability and sophistication, they have maintained a lot more direct control over a lot of Chinese policy, more so than lower level party officials have. So this is likely an attempt for the Xi administration to keep the choke chain pretty tight, to make sure that the military does not get any ideas about supplanting CCP leadership and turning the country into more of a strocratic system.
Yes, and that will undoubtedly have all sorts of consequences with regards to Taiwan as the years go by. I think, as we've mentioned before, it's unlikely that as a result of these purges, an attack on Taiwan is any more likely in the short term, but in the long term, it is possible that we may see a more loyal military to Xi Jinping and therefore less likely to speak the truth to power and to go along with what he wants to do. So definitely something we're keeping an eye on the long term. But I think with that, we'll have to wrap it up for today. As a reminder to our listeners, if you'd like a more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to all of these topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Jared. And thank you all for listening, and take care.